Russia has lent into their spring offensive early, and by any metric, it's been a failure. They're making grinding progress in Bakhmut.
I want to get your thoughts first of all, if I can, on the Sudan operation, which depends so much on the use of military aircraft. All sorts of problems about security and just making the whole thing work. A logistical nightmare for for some air vice marshal or other.
Well, yes, I mean it's a challenge because apparently 2,000 British nationals signed up for the Foreign Office evacuation plan, but it's not entirely clear how many of those would want to travel by air, and those who do want to travel, whether they're actually able to make it to the airfield, the Wadi Saidna airfield, that's just about 30 k's north of Khartoum airport. I mean, the numbers to date from last night were about 536 had been extracted. But if you look at the number of aircraft, that was six flights, so they evidently were not full. And that therefore implies that these aircraft are not flying at capacity at the moment.
Hmm.
So the difficulty is how many actually still want to travel and how many are just struggling to make that journey.
And what about the business of making that transport operation secure? Because you never know where the challenge of the threat is going to come from.
Well, that's the issue. One of the ways, I mean, there's lots of ways of getting out of the country. One of them is driving. The trouble is, there's lots of roadblocks. Fuel is in short supply. It's 500 miles across to Port Sudan, where the Royal Navy might be having a ship there shortly. But even if you get out to the airport, you still got to drive there. And of course, one of the options was to send British forces in to Khartoum itself, but that would have been a nightmare. You've got two military factions fighting each other, a whole lot of looting going on. Introducing an extra armed force in there could have well have put British military not only at risk but actually as a target. So undoubtedly, there's been some really interesting planning going on by the British government and the British military, trying to work out how most effectively to get people out, give them a route out. And as you suggested earlier on the show, that one of the challenges is this ceasefire that was brokered between the head of the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Force, this sort of formerly rebel force, expires at midnight. But there's evident diplomatic efforts to try to extend that, and the Sudanese army general apparently was open to another 72-hour extension, but nothing heard from the Rapid Support Force. So that window is going to close pretty quickly unless something else
No,
happens.
we're going to be watching that, obviously. Now, on Ukraine, Sean, we now see a report that the Deputy Defense Minister of Russia, Colonel General Mikhail Mizhintsev, has been booted by Vladimir Putin. So another casualty high up in the political military pyramid in Russia. They seem to drop like flies, don't they? What do you make about this one, the Deputy Defense Minister?
Well, there's been so many shuffling of the pack, haven't there, over the last year? And this is quite normal in warfare. The Allies did it in the Second World War. You move people about, particularly if they are not successful on the battlefield. And by any metric, Russia has struggled on the battlefield. The challenge is they've got Gerasimov running the army, and Sergei Shoigu are the two most senior colleagues that Russia has. They're friends of President Putin. So it's very difficult to see them moving. So the blame game sort of filters down. At the moment, if you were to take this as a sort of grand strategic level, Russia has lent into their spring offensive early. And by any metric, it's been a failure. They're making grinding progress in Bakhmut. And I think, in a way, it's a sad reflection of our media today that because, an MP resigning takes 4 hours of coverage, we're not covering Ukraine at all. I was spending quite a session at Sky News earlier today, and there's much more focus on Sudan, and yet the war, the casualties, and the brutality of war is alive and well every day at the moment in Ukraine. And I think Russia, as you say, there are some of the leading generals that are paying the price for a lack of progress.
And some reports also of the Russian military running out of important pieces of ammunition, the rockets that are used to fire in to support the forces fighting on the front line. Those rockets are running short, which does not bode terribly well as one would wish when it comes to these coming offensives.
Well, again, John, there's been a lot of talk about. So, for example, there was a lot of talk a few months ago, and it was leaked documents that Ukraine was running short of surface-to-air missiles to provide air defence for Kyiv and other cities. Actually, when you look closely at the documentation, what it was actually saying is if we don't get a resupply, then we will run short in the springtime.
Mm.
And part of that is a demand signal to try and make sure the West leans into it. I think what's been fascinating is that Ukraine probably would have wanted to have a period of calm before it started its offensive. Russia has not allowed it to do that. And Bakhmut is a really good example where, by all accounts, Russia finally controls about 85, 86% of the city. But after 11 months of fighting, potentially 35,000 casualties, that's a huge price to pay for a relatively small city. But Ukraine, about 98% of the West's equipment has now been delivered. There's a lot of tanks, rockets, artillery, mortars, ammunition, million rounds of ammunition, and of course, most importantly, the training. UK alone will have trained over 20,000 Ukrainian armed forces, and that's just the UK. This is a Western collaborative effort. So I think the real challenge for me, though, is how far and how successful will Ukraine be with whatever counteroffensive they take? Because bluntly, the West's patience for this war will start to wane,
Yes.
and most Western analysts believe this is an unwinnable war for Ukraine, and therefore this fighting is more about where the line gets drawn on a map, and how long will that go on for? That's a fascinating conversation for a bottle of wine, I think.